So without further ado, we can get underway. Uh, just a brief introduction of Erika and her work. Erika Bachiochi is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and she is a legal scholar who works at the intersection of constitutional law, political theory, women's history, and Catholic social teaching. She's also editor-in-chief of Fairer Disputations, the online journal of the Mercy Otis Warren Initiative for Women in Civic Life and Thought at the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at ASU. She is a 2024 to 2025 fellow at the Nessie Center for Faith and Culture at the University of Thomas Houston, where she teaches women's history course in UST's new Catholic Women and Gender Studies program. Just a few other little brief details. A 2018 visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, Erika is also a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she founded the Wollstonecraft Project. Her latest book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming Lost Vision, was published by Notre Dame University Press in 2021 and was named a finalist for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's 2022 Conservative Book of the Year Award. Ms. Bachiochi's work and essays have appeared in publications such as the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, Christian Bioethics, New York Times, The Atlantic, Politico, First Things, American Compass, CNN, National Review Online, National Affairs, SCOTUS Blog, and Public Discourse. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Erika, who's going to talk to us about lessons from America's earliest female doctors and advocates for women. Thanks very much, Erika.
Thank you, Xavier. It's really wonderful to be with you all over the world. So as Xavier said, I've been asked to speak with you today about some lessons we can learn from the earliest female doctors and women's rights advocates in mid-19th century America on the issue of abortion. And along the way, especially at the outset of the talk, I'm going to include some constitutional law. I realize you are from all over the world. Some of you are sleeping, I think, right now, but I'm going to limit my remarks to an American context, which is the one I know best. But given the US's influence on the rest of the world, especially in these kinds of questions, I think it's really probably helpful for you to all understand this in any event. So let me give you a full sense at the outset here of where I'm going in this presentation. So in the second half, part 2 of my talk, I'm going to dive directly into what the title is, into the thought of some of our earliest female doctors, like Elizabeth Blackwell and Alice Stockham, who were beginning their medical practices, were the first to receive medical licenses. At the very same time, the first national conventions for women's rights were taking place. So, for instance, Elizabeth Blackwell received her medical license in 1849. The year before, 1848, marks the first local meeting of women's rights advocates at Seneca Falls in New York. And the year after, in 1850, marks the first national convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. So in this second part of the talk, I'm going to look in particular at how the early women's rights advocates and these first female doctors agreed with prominent male physicians at the American Medical Association about the nature of abortion. To the early feminist and the male and female doctors, abortion that was not induced to save the mother's life was considered the unwarrantable destruction of human life. However, as I'll explain in some detail, these very same female physicians and women's advocates strongly disputed the disparaging views about women voiced by some of these same male doctors, in particular, Horatio Storer most prominently. And the second part of the talk is especially important for those of you working as pro-life physicians in the American context, I think. And so though I'm going to come back to Storer in the second part of the talk, I want to give you kind of an account right now as to why you should care about any of this history at all. And for that, I'm going to quickly look at the Supreme Court's recent opinion overturning Roe v. Wade in Dobbs v. Jackson 2 years ago. Again, this is all by way of introduction to kind of the meat of my talk, but I think it has to be said to give you a frame and context for why this is important. So Dr. Horatio Storer is really the boogeyman of much pro-choice legal literature on this historic time period that I'm covering today. Why? Because he, and under his leadership, the AMA, successfully argued for states to extend legal protections beyond the common law concept of quickening to protect unborn human beings throughout pregnancy as more consistent, they argued, with then current embryology. And so he is credited or blamed for his influence on state laws that grew in both number and strength in the mid to late 19th century. After all, these store influence state laws are the very same laws that Roe struck down in 1973 and that the Dobbs court brought back to life 2 years ago. Indeed, the court's opinion in Dobbs pointed to these 19th century laws collected in an appendix, a pretty long appendix, a page of which I'd put on the screen, as good evidence of the status of abortion before and after the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868. Why? Well, because the guarantees of the 14th Amendment, due process, liberty, and equal protection of the laws, are the constitutional provisions that abortion advocates, as I'm sure you all know, have long argued protect easy abortion access, and until Dobbs did protect such access. So the question in Dobbs, of course, was whether the Supreme Court over these several decades had gotten the Constitution right. So the court in Dobbs held that we can really only understand what the framers and ratifiers of the 14th Amendment meant by liberty vis-a-vis abortion by understanding how abortion was treated legally at that time. And as Dobbs rightly points out, at that time, abortion was prohibited throughout pregnancy in nearly every state. So the Dobbs court held the framers and ratifiers of the 14th Amendment couldn't have meant that liberty included a woman's right to intentionally end the life of her unborn child. Thus, Dobbs says, the court in Roe and its progeny had it wrong. The 14th Amendment does not protect abortion rights. But in the pro-choice legal literature, both before and since Dobbs, the historian's amicus brief to the court, which I'm now putting up on the screen, all point to Storer's disparaging views about abortion, which are employed to argue that those 19th century fetal protective laws, by their very nature, disparage women. And this, as I'm sure you all know, is the most popular legal argument in the pro choice arsenal, the one having tremendous impact in state referenda and state courts today, that fetal protective laws discriminate against or disparage women. And the scholars often point to the statements by Horatio Storer and the AMA at the time as evidence for this claim. And I will get to those statements in part two. So this is all to say at the outset here that this history I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes unveiling very much matters today. And in some sense, the history focused lens of the Supreme Court today makes history matter even more. But neither pro choice advocates, of course, nor even the Dobbs court shined a bright light on the views of the female doctors and women's rights advocates working and writing in this very same time frame. And in fact, many of the female doctors were interacting with Horatio Storer. So this is what I want to do for you today. So part two looks at the disagreement between the women's rights advocates and female doctors on the one hand, and Horatio Storer and some of these male doctors in the AMA on the other. And importantly, this is a debate between those who are all opposed to intentional sort of abortion, but one that has been utterly ignored in our day. But to prepare you for that debate, I want to first offer, in part one, a quick primer on the 19th century women's movement writ large. So that's what I'm going to jump into now. And I have to do this because much of this basic history has been entirely lost to our collective consciousness as well. And it's going to entirely inform and give sort of a frame and make sort of obvious to you why this debate, in fact, happened. Indeed, part of modern feminism or abortion rights feminism's success has been to read its own ideological commitments back into that earliest movement that advocated for women and their rights, and then to ahistorically equate women's rights with sexual license, radical autonomy, and abortion rights. Many people, including Christians and pro-life advocates today, have assumed the veracity of the now dominant narrative that kind of women's rights and abortion rights go hand in hand. Lost then from both history And contemporary debates is the original pro-life, pro-family, quintessentially American account of women's rights as knit together with their responsibilities, the one beautifully articulated in the United States in the mid 19th century. So let's look then at the economic, legal, and cultural conditions that led to this movement. And then we'll turn to some of the early thinking about women and about rights. And then I promise I'll get back to the early female doctors and their male interlocutors before too long. Okay, so the mid 19th century women's movement rose up. Whoops, sorry, I've somehow just lost what I was looking at. Okay. So the mid 19th century women's movement rose up in response to the Industrial Revolution's impact on Americans' largely agrarian society as factories drew men and then poorer women out of family farms and shops to earn wages. As paid labor left the home and with it men too, wage earning husbands became newly dependent upon industrial capitalists, making caregiving women dependent upon the wages of their husbands as they hadn't been before. The common interests of husband and wife as they labored together in the productive agrarian household had begun to fray in the new economy, even as much traditional household work began to be displaced by these same technological developments. Just consider the textile industry. In 1810, 90% was produced in family households, and particularly by the women in those households. With the development of the industrial loom, this highly skilled labor was moved into factories. This is all to say that industrialization had an enormous impact on families and the relation between the sexes. I put a lot up on the screen, and as an aside, I've written quite a bit about this and how we might glean insight from the agrarian model of homework integration today. And I've hyperlinked, I think, if you can get that, two essays at the bottom of the screen in addition to my book, which I'll link to later. Okay, so what about the legal conditions? This is our sort of economic conditions. Well, under the common law of coverture, now, to define common law really quickly, I suspect you're all super intelligent, so you know what it is. But I think it's important for those who don't, who aren't lawyers, who don't sort of understand common and civil law and how the Constitution relates to that. When the founders created the Constitution, it's a document that's meant to govern the federal government. And they all knew, they were all lawyers, that in each of the states, the common law, which was what was governing what is private law, private interactions between, so Constitution is governing public law, common law is governing private law. So that is torts, criminal law, family law, and property law. And all of those are governed at the state level and were untouched really by the Constitution. They were brought over from England and all of those early lawyers read their Blackstone. So the common law was very, very important at that time. So under the common law of coverture, which is that law that governs sort of family relations and especially marital relations, a married woman's legal existence, her very being, was subsumed into that of her husband. She lost any rights she held as a single woman and was placed under her husband's assumed beneficence and goodwill, or cover. But this long-standing legal arrangement, already risky, you can imagine, for the wife of a vicious husband, was particularly ill-suited to the new economy. After all, families often needed wives to supplement their husband's income and to participate in how it was spent. But women lacked rights to transfer property, even their own property that they had brought into the marriage, or to execute contracts. In cases of neglect, abandonment, and abuse, married women had to find the means to fully provide for themselves and their children, or to take custody of them. But coverture also assumed the children were their fathers, and the wife's earnings belonged to her husband as well. And because many women at this time also lacked the educational, economic, and legal means to independently earn a living for themselves, they were often thrust into marriages and the full dependency that coverture marriage entailed out of sheer economic need. Now, meanwhile, to shore up a kind of vision of the home as a loving haven from the kind of dog eat dog industrializing world, women were increasingly depicted culturally and really by means of their education as fragile and weak. a recurring trope in Western thought that has never quite described actual women or, as I explained before, their significant economic contribution in the household in every age. So, on the heels of the Second Great Awakening, which is really a religious revival in the US that especially impacted women and got a lot of women kind of back into churches, middle class Christian women became inspired to spearhead local and eventually national charitable organizations. They sought to fight against not only the ongoing moral outrage of slavery, but also the social upheaval and economic precarity that industrialization had inflicted upon women and children, especially on the margins of society. And so they began to organize themselves and speak out publicly against slavery, child labor, illiteracy, domestic abuse, intemperance, marital rape, coverture marriage, and the legal and societal factors, especially the sexual double standard, that contributed in their minds to growing rates of prostitution, infanticide, and abortion. But as they did so, more conservative Christians began to denounce these women's public advocacy as natural or unwomanly. So even before the women's movement, this early women's movement could even begin to make claims for their own civil and political rights as needed to carry out their responsibilities to their families in this new economic age. Its earliest leaders found it necessary to offer an account of woman as a rational and responsible being, accountable first and foremost, not to man, but to God. And so women, like the devout Quaker abolitionist Sarah Grimke, turned to the Bible to help them do so. Sorry, I've skipped a slide. There we go. And there they found in Genesis that God made woman as a suitable companion to man, in all respects his equal, one that was like him, gifted with intellect, and endowed with immortality, a moral and responsible being. But they argued lack of adequate education and coverture marriage, which even made husbands responsible for the bad acts of their wives, had kept women absolutely dependent and morally immature, ultimately answerable to man rather than to God. On the eve of the first National Convention, Women's Rights Convention in 1850, one of the most beloved leaders of this early movement, Lucretia Mott, responded to this prevalent challenge that women's public advocacy was making them unwomanly and taking them out of their appropriate sphere. In a 1849 speech, then, she writes insightfully of two versions of womanhood: one true because cultivated, mature, and refined, and the other immature, childish, and thereby not fully realized. In response to the claim that these women wish to act like men, Mott explicitly defended both sexual difference and women's responsibility to develop her own capacities. She writes, "We would admit all the difference that our great and beneficent Creator has made in relation of man and woman. Nor would we seek to disturb this relation, but we deny that the present position of women in her true sphere of is her true sphere of usefulness. Indeed, Mott happily points to women's difference from man in nature, configuration, and physical strength, concluding, we are satisfied with nature. But she argues, women like men have a duty to develop their God-given powers and human capacities for the good." Mott was worried, as so many female writers before and after her, that women's want of liberal education and mature responsibilities were leading some to a degenerate into a kind of effeminacy, a sentimentality in which she is satisfied to be the mere plaything or toy of society, content with her outward adornings and the tone of flattery. Mott argues that to become a true woman, she must understand her duties, physical, intellectual, and moral, and cultivate her powers as a moral and responsible being. An education aimed solely at domesticity, especially in this post industrial context or industrializing context, could not enable women to cultivate the maturity and intellectual virtue they needed for true spousal companionship, the noble work of motherhood, or engaged Republican citizenship, all of which they argued a truly liberal education would provide. Likewise, Leader Paulina Davis's speech on the education of females at the first National Convention decried the widespread valorization of a certain kind of female effeminacy that masqueraded as woman's nature per se. Cultivated, Davis argues, for the delights of her affectional nature, the heart is disproportionately developed, and she is made a creature of pure feeling and passionate impulse. She continues, intellectual culture of any kind which might abate or stead or balance feeling is held unwomanly, and the sex is enslaved by the disproportionate activity of its own distinguishing traits. The overstrength of her heart, Davis concludes, is exaggerated by the weakness of her head. Another leader, Lucy Stone, explained at an 1856 convention the rightful ends for which human capacities were given to women, equally with men. When God made the human soul and gave it certain capacities, he meant that those capacities should be exercised. The wing of the bird indicates its right to fly, and the fin of the fish its right to swim. So, in human beings, the existence of a power presupposes the right to its use, subject to the law of benevolence. Finally, Abby Price, a close friend of Walt Whitman, said at the first National Convention that it was not necessary to maintain that the sexes are, quote, adapted to the same positions and duties as men in order to argue for women and men's equal rights. Rather, the key truth that must be affirmed was that they, quote, are absolutely equal in their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, by which Price meant their rights to do and to be individually and socially all they are capable of, and to attain the highest usefulness and happiness obediently to the divine moral law. Thus, the early advocates not only fought for women to be liberally and morally educated so they could fulfill their human capacities and their particular duties excellently, but they also called upon women to resist their era's depiction of them as fragile and weak, to undertake responsibly the demands of motherhood, for instance, a privilege that made them, in the words of one advocate, second only to God. Women needed to be intellectually, morally, and physically strong for their own sake, their husbands, and their children's too. But the early advocates weren't just demanding of themselves and of society at large. The early American women's movement also made strong demands of caddish men to stop treating women as playthings or objects for their sexual appetites, or even as sentimental, childlike spaniels designed only to please and to be admired by them. These women wished to be regarded as persons worthy not only of affection, but of dignity and respect, especially within marriage, which they very much valorized. But society and education, they argued, had ill prepared them for such. Now, before we specify with some detail their views of abortion, how does all of this general outlook compare with the feminism of today? Modern feminists, after all, also recognize women and men's shared human capacities. But whereas these early advocates worked for women to be recognized as morally responsible agents, accountable to God for the benevolent use of those capacities, obedient to the divine moral law, modern feminism instead elevates personal autonomy as men and women's shared or common human common goal. When taken to its radical extreme, advocates of personal autonomy, or etymologically, autonomy means the rule of the self, imagine no higher law than the will or determination of the individual. Early feminism thus fought against women being arbitrarily subjected under unbounded and sometimes tyrannical men. Today's feminism fights for the unbounded subjection of each self to its sometimes, often, tyrannical desires. So, as both the American founders and the early American feminists understood, freedom without the channeling guide of the virtues conformed to the divine moral law of benevolence is not properly freedom at all. It is a dangerous ideological abstraction for women, men, and the children in their care. So today, the very phrase women's rights is often taken as inclusive of or even synonymous with the right to intentionally end the life of one's dependent unborn child. In this view, rights are a kind of license for personal and sexual autonomy, kind of the abstract freedom to determine a future unhindered by, a freedom from unchosen moral or bodily constraints. In sharp contrast, rights for the antebellum movement, as at the American founding, were always correlated with concrete responsibilities, freedom for doing what one ought. Indeed, in some cases, rights and responsibilities read not as opposites, as we often think of them today, but rather as synonyms. As Lucy Stone put what the movement was up to most poignantly, we are all getting to be women's rights advocates, or rather, investigators of women's duties. And so, with rights and responsibilities always correlative in this way, it would have been philosophically untenable to have a right to end the lives of their unborn children. Rather, they pursued their rights in part to carry out the responsibilities they had to those children. Okay, so on to part 2 of this talk. Now, in the recent Dobbs case, the dissenting justices and many of the courts since argued that, of course, states at the time of the 14th Amendment prohibited abortion. Due to the absence of women in legislatures, as well as their second class status at that time generally, now I'm going to quote the dissent, it is perhaps not surprising that the ratifiers were not perfectly attuned to the importance of reproductive rights for women's liberty, or for their capacity to participate as equal members of our nation. They go on to say they did not perceive women as equals and did not recognize women's rights. This is to argue that if women had had more political power at the time, the 14th Amendment would have been understood to protect induced or elective abortion. But that suggestion entirely ignores the fact that the early feminists, again, those arguing for their rights at the very same time, did not just fail to agitate for a right to abortion. They viewed the increased availability of underground abortion at that time as grossly inimical to their interests. The dissent in Dobbs may have been trying to preempt this awkward point, which, of course, some people know from organizations like Feminists for Life, who put out sort of the pro life views of these women, when it patronizingly writes, and this is again the Dobbs dissent, to be sure, most women in 1868, again at the time of the ratification of the 14th Amendment, had a foreshortened view of their rights. If most men could not then imagine giving women control over their own bodies, most women could not have imagined that kind of autonomy, says Justice Kagan. But if you actually look at what these women said, the 19th century feminist opposition to abortion was not a deviation from their advocacy for women's agency or capitulation to the era's derogatory views about women's capacities or status. Rather, their opposition to abortion flowed from their advocacy for women's and for children's interests. The actual views of early women's advocates and female doctors, therefore, undermines this prevalent idea that the fetal protective statutes that Roe struck down and that Dobbs rehabilitated had their origins in misogyny. It also undermines the view that derogatory views of women remain the basis for legal protections of unborn children today. Now, certainly the history of the AMA campaign to protect unborn children in the mid to late 19th century and the writings of one of its most influential and provocative leaders, Horatio Storer, are entirely relevant to understanding the context in which every state and all territories would come over a period of several decades to prohibit nearly all elective abortions. But the strong anti abortion voices of the women's rights advocates of the period, including prominent female doctors who knew and interacted with and even worked with Horatio Storer professionally, are also highly relevant to understanding the context behind 19th century protections for fetal life. These early feminist views have been ignored, misconstrued, or given far less attention in pro choice legal scholarship and advocacy, and really in pro life responses to the same. And yet these women played an important role in their era's widespread condemnation of abortion as the unjust killing of vulnerable human life, even as they agitated for their full civil and political rights. So let's try to put this all together. So, contrary to the Dobbs dissent suggestion, the 19th century women's rights advocates voiced strong opinions about controlling their own bodies and about abortion, too. Indeed, self governance, or what they called voluntary motherhood, was a central plank in the early women's movement. By this term, voluntary motherhood, they meant the right to engage voluntarily in that act that might make one a mother. Indeed, they recognized women to be mothers with all the responsibilities of motherhood, not just when their children were born, but from the time they begin developing in their mother's wombs. Thus, they wanted the right to decline sex within marriage against the traditional male prerogative and even the specter of what we now call marital rape. They wanted to enter freely without coercion into the responsibilities that pregnancy demanded of them by determining when and with whom they would engage in sex. The 19th century women's advocates and female doctors based their vocal opposition to abortion on the scientific reality, understood by that time, that abortion ends the life of a developing prenatal child. On this point, these women and the AMA doctors like Storr were in complete agreement. As suffragist and hospital reformer Dr. Anna Dunsmore stated in 1869, the living principle is there from the first moment of fecundation and should be fostered and nourished and brought into the world in every instance that conception takes place. In the late 1860s, Densmore offered a lecture series called Physiology. It was advertised in the early feminist newspaper, The Revolution, which was the newspaper of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And what the lecture series did was taught the then current scientific and medical understandings about pregnancy and fetal development. In explaining to the attendees that the child's life began well before the mother was aware of the child movement at quickening, she declared that the matter was, quote, the least one understood and the one of all others necessary to be well comprehended in order that the duties and responsibilities of maternity and child culture should be realized. The Revolution reported that Densmore sought to counter the prevailing notion that, quote, the little being was devoid of life during the earlier period of gestation, and described that several women fainted when they recognized that they had been, quote, participants in the crime of premeditated child destruction before birth. Female doctors like Densmore and women's rights advocates like the radical Victoria Woodhull saw little difference between the crime of infanticide and abortion. Woodhull, who was the first woman to run for president, wrote just 2 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment that children's rights, quote, begin while yet they remain the fetus. She elaborated elsewhere, and I'm going to get down to this is the fourth quote on the screen. Many women would be shocked at the very thought of killing their children after birth, deliberately destroy them previously. If there's any difference in the actual crime, we should be glad to have those who practice the latter, that is abortion, pointed out. The truth of the matter is that it is just as much a murder to destroy life in its embryonic condition as it is to destroy it after the fully developed form is attained. For it is the self-same life that is taken. In 1889, OBGYN Alice Bunker Stockham, who is the fifth woman licensed in the United States to practice medicine, as far as we know, published her popular book, Toxology. It educated lay women about the physiology of the female body, fetal development, pregnancy, and childbirth. By 1892, the book had sold over 200,000 copies and was translated into 5 different languages. In the book's subsection on feticide, in the chapter on abortion, Stockham, like Anna Dunsmore, instructed her readers in accord with scientific understanding of the day that human beings begin their lives at conception. And then she writes, quote, many women have been taught to think that the child is not viable until after quickening, and that there's no harm in arresting pregnancy previous to the feeling of motion. Others believe that there's no life until birth and the cry of the child is heard. Stockham then draws the moral and legal conclusion from the scientific one. Quote, by what false reasoning does she convince herself that another life still more dependent upon her for its existence, with equal rights and possibilities, has no claim upon her for protection? The woman who produces abortion or allows it to be produced risks her own life and health in the act and commits the highest crime in the calendar, for she takes the life of her own child. She defrauds the child of the right to its existence. Now, to my mind, it's particularly ironic that many pro choice feminist legal scholars insist that our modern law retains something like the early common law's treatment of quickening as a significant demarcation of the legal status of the unborn child. The common law, after all, rested upon a scientifically rudimentary understanding of fetal development, which had to rely upon woman's subjective feeling to detect and track the progression of a pregnancy. But our country's earliest female doctors worked to correct the outdated medical understanding of their lay peers, just as the 19th century women's rights advocates worked to correct the common law's erroneous conception of women in coverture, as I explained earlier in this talk. In light of the reality of fetal development, as well as the health risks to women who procured abortions, both the male and female doctors were concerned about the increasing incidence of elective abortion, which the New York Times called the evil of the age. And so, as I mentioned at the outset, the female doctors were of like mind with Storrs led AMA characterization of abortion. Quote, that while physicians have been united in condemning, this is the State Medical Society, which also was a statement of the AMA, that while physicians have long been united in condemning the procuring of abortion, which of course was in the Hippocratic Oath, at every period of gestation, except as necessary for preserving the life of either mother or child, it has become the duty of this association, in view of the prevalence and increasing frequency of the crime, publicly to enter an earnest and solemn protest against such unwarrantable destruction of human life. As explored in an excellent book, Pity for Evil, Suffrage, Abortion, and Women's Empowerment in Reconstruction America, a book that I would highly recommend to all of you, quote, pioneering women doctors like Maria, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that last name, and Anita Ting agreed with Storr's condemnation of abortion. They also considered the increasing prevalence of abortion as an important reason why there should be more women in medicine. This latter point, that more women should be in medicine, was one that Storr heartily rejected. In 1878, Dr. Ting published quote on the a quote an essay or a report on the causes of ill health among women for the Rhode Island Board of Health annual report. In the report, she credited Storr for bringing increased public attention to the increase of this evil. She identified three causes of this, quote, crying sin of the age. And just as an aside, I would imagine this increase is very much due to the same context that we talked about earlier, industrialization, and a lot of poor women being foisted into industrial labor. So, what are these kind of three causes? First, men's maltreatment of women, which we're going to hear more about in a moment. Second, ignorance of fetal development, which we've already heard quite a bit about. And third, the commercialization of abortion through advertisement of quack doctors. Many women, Ting claimed, chose to procure abortions under the quote, erroneous idea that in the early months of pregnancy there is no sin and little danger to the woman's life, no cognizance of the murder of the child or ill health of the woman for the remainder of her life. Ting recommended that parents, quote, teach their children early in life the wisdom of subjugating their appetites to morality and to cultivate a regard for the rights of others. For her part, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman licensed to practice medicine in the United States, lamented the reputation of Madame Restel as a female physician. Restel was a particularly well-known and immensely profitable abortionist in New York City in the mid to late 19th century. Blackwell wrote in her 1895 autobiography, quote, that this honorable term, female physician, should be exclusively applied at that time to those women who carried out this shocking trade seems to me a horror. It was an utter degradation of what might and should become a noble position for women, of course, medicine. She continued, the gross perversion and destruction of motherhood by the abortionists filled me with indignation and awakened active antagonism. We never hear this when we learn about Elizabeth Blackwell as the first female doctor in the United States, do we? Another female doctor expressed a similar sentiment about the unfortunate association of the term female physician with abortionists like Restel. And this doctor and Blackwell together tried to stop Restel in her vile career. But the lawyer they consulted with told them, quote, she is a personal necessity and will be protected by rich and influential personages. And I'm getting this all from that wonderful book, Pity for Evil. The popular women's rights newspaper, The Revolution, owned again by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, also sought to expose restlessism, the term they coined for Restel's line of work. In an editorial by that same title, the paper told of Dr. Charlotte Lozier, a young female physician who had been approached by a man who had traveled to New York City seeking to procure from her an abortion for his young mistress who was carrying his child. The editorial chronicled that Lozier had assured the man that he had come to the wrong place for any shameful, revolting, unnatural, and unlawful purpose, and when he became angry and grew abusive, Lozier had him arrested. Lozier, like Densmore and Stockham, believed that ignorance of the nature of fetal development was a chief cause of abortion's prevalence. But Lozier also emphasized legal remedies, with the New York Times reporting that a lecture of hers called for, quote, medical education for women and more stringent enforcement of the laws against abortion. Okay, so this is all to show how the early feminists and female doctors agreed with how the male doctors in the AMA characterized the nature of abortion as, again, the unwarrantable destruction of human life. But these women strenuously disagreed with the AMA's characterization of women, as well as the causes of abortion and who should be considered culpable. As pro-choice legal scholars have rightly noted, then, some of the most vocal anti-abortion doctors tended to place the blame for abortion squarely on the women themselves, and some, such as Storer, spoke in terms that revealed their wish to confine women to motherhood as opposed to women's entry into professions such as medicine. So, for instance, the 1871 AMA report on criminal abortion included this claim. I'm just going to read the first and part of the second, and there's more, obviously, on the slide. Is it not errant laziness, sheer, craven, culpable cowardice, which is at the bottom of this? Sorry, I just lost my. um, is it not errant laziness, sheer, craven, culpable cowardice, which at the bottom of the Space Act have you the right to choose an indolent, selfish life, neglecting the work God has appointed you to perform? Is self-indulgence the only thing to be sought in this life? Now, in sharp contrast, the women's rights advocates and female doctors faulted instead the sexual double standard and the male sexual prerogative, as well as women's unequal status in marriage and society. As women's rights advocate Matilda Gage put it, it is clear to my mind that this evil wholly arises from the false position which women occupies in civil society. Gage, along with other early feminists, pointed out that men's unrestrained sexual appetites inside and outside of marriage and subsequent lack of paternal responsibility often put women in a position where they felt powerless to refuse sex and then were left to deal with the consequences on their own. Seeming to respond preemptively to the AMA rhetoric, Gage wrote powerfully in 1869 about the situation of women. Quote, to my certain knowledge, this crime is not confined to those whose love of ease, amusement, and fashionable life leads to desire immunity from the cares of children, but it is practiced by those whose inmost souls revolt from the dreadful deed. So Gage asks in an editorial, this editorial in the Revolution, what then has driven these women to the desperation necessary to force them to commit such a deed, her response castigates the common law doctrines of both coverture and consortium, or the husband's kind of sexual prerogative in marriage, in which, quote, the wife has no right over her own body. Now, we hear that often as a abortion, pro-abortion sentiment, but please listen. She captures well the movement as a whole. Guilty, yes, no matter what the motive, love of ease or desire to save from suffering the unborn innocent, the woman is awfully guilty who commits the deed. It will burden her conscience in life, and it will burden her soul in death. But oh, thrice guilty is he who, for selfish gratification, heedless of her prayers, indifferent to her fate, drove her to the desperation which impelled her to the crime. Sarah Norton of the Working Women's Association, who successfully advocated for women's admission to Cornell University, likewise cast blame directly on the sexual double standard. She advocated for a time when the, quote, unchastity in men will be placed on an equality with the unchastity of women, and the right of the unborn will not be denied or interfered with. So these women did not seek to imitate men's autonomous capacity to walk away from paternal responsibility, as today's feminists tend to in their advocacy. Instead, they wish for men to meet women at a high standard of sexual integrity, reciprocity, companionship, and care. The early feminists and female doctors lamented not only the social and economic conditions that pushed some women into prostitution, loveless, or ill suited marriages, to abortion and infanticide. They also believed that increasingly available abortive methods and even nascent contraceptive methods decoupled sex from childbearing and so empowered men to prioritize their own sexual satisfaction and to ignore the asymmetrical consequences of the act to women. The sexual double standard tolerated male sexual misadventure, and even as it blamed women for ending up unwillingly pregnant as a result. These women therefore fought judicial decisions that ignored these mitigating circumstances, and they fervently sought to better the condition of women's lives. These early feminists therefore decried the inattention the male dominated medical, legal, and political establishment gave the underlying causes and mitigating factors involved, but they never condoned the act of intentional abortion itself. Gage captured the sentiment well. Much as I deplore the horrible crime of child murder, which was a synonym for abortion, I cannot believe that such a law would have the desired effect. It seems to me to be only mowing off the top of the noxious weed, while the root remains. We want prevention, not merely punishment. We must reach the root of the evil and destroy it. And so the early women's rights advocates thereby focused their efforts on those educational, cultural, and legal means that would so improve women's lives that they would not feel the need to seek abortions. Advocates like Gage, Norton, and Stanton, and doctors like Densmore, Stockham, and Ting thus worked for improvements in maternal and fetal health, founded female-staffed hospitals for women, sought to raise awareness about fetal development and women's fertility, and raise funds for creating maternity homes where vulnerable mothers would be supported to nurture and raise their children with confidence. And again, I just suggest you all get that book, Pity for Evil, where all of this is laid out in really beautiful detail, especially with regard to the female doctors. And it's really in all my research of these of the 19th century, it's really the first book to really hone in on those female doctors and in several other chapters. So before I end here and open it up for your questions, I want to, by way of a conclusion, to underscore the profound reversal that takes place in the second wave of feminism in the 1970s, but really begins decades before with Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger's push for the birth control pill. If the early women's rights advocates and female doctors worked for moral, legal, and political reforms to respond more justly to the defining asymmetry between men and women, the fact that women can get pregnant and men can't. Sanger intervened with a technological solution for this reproductive asymmetry. To this day, technological responses continue to crowd out more humane feminist calls for recovery of sexual integrity and the shared duties of care of both women and men in parenthood. In a word, 19th century feminism was turned on its head. After all, that act that women's rights advocates once considered evidence of women's unequal status in society is now championed as an essential component of women's equal status today. That dreadful deed that poor souls revolted in committing, as Gage put it, is now the privileged response to female poverty in our day. And that practice that Doctors Lozier and Blackwell viewed as antithetical to a degradation of the medical profession has become understood, as all of you know, by so many as a basic aspect of healthcare today. So I think we ought to reclaim the wisdom, vision, and lessons of those early female doctors and advocates for women. If we don't, those of us on this call, who will? Thanks so much, and I'm eager to hear from you.